Just a few days ago, Geoff Keighley released the final hours of Half-Life Alyx, an in-depth development commentary on everything that led to Half-Life Alyx's release, including a lot of cancelled projects between Portal 2 and HLA. It also went into details on cut concepts, both story and mechanics, from Half-Life Alyx itself. And although I have spent the better part of my last 10 years looking for as much information on anything Valve, it's no surprise that there is a significant amount that I learned from reading the final hours. So here is, in no particular order, about 40 things that I learned while reading through Geoff Keighley's recently released The Final Hours of Half-Life Alyx. Starting small, in an image of a scheduled whiteboard from February 3rd of this year, it is marked that Russell had voice work done less than 1 month before ship. Back in 2014, an anonymous NeoGAF user going by the name Seaboat leaked a PowerPoint presentation about Source 2's recreation of the plantation level from Left 4 Dead 2. We had a few screenshots, one of which being high resolution, and ever since then we've never really heard much about it. A few leaks have told me in the interim that this was just a graphical update, and was just done as a test for Source 2. As seen within the final hours, an original fly-through video of this plantation level is released, and it's mind-blowing to be able to see this image start to move. This plantation remake predates the release of Portal 2. Then we have Alien Swarm. Quote, but Valve's traditional games suddenly stopped after the release of Alien Swarm in 2010, which for a brief period was themed around Half-Life. The fact that the Alien Swarm remake that Valve released in July of 2010 was at one point themed around the Half-Life series is news to me. For those unaware, Alien Swarm was originally an Unreal Tournament 2004 total conversion mod that Valve brought in order to be able to create an official retail version of the game. However, it was in development hell for a very short period of time, and then Valve just announces the game unceremoniously only a few days before release, promising very little in the future and then never touching it again. Another quick one, quote, the room located inside of Valve's HQ at Skyline Tower in Bellevue was named for the particular office set up to showcase Valve's cutting-edge VR technologies, with a series of black and white QR-like codes printed on the walls called fiducials. Next, Left 4 Dead 3. Quote, other potential Source 2 projects were more familiar, like an exploration of a new Left 4 Dead game. In 2013, a team of nearly 30 developers dreamed of an open-world Left 4 Dead 3. The game, set in Morocco, would have featured hundreds of zombies, but it wasn't long until the team discovered that the Source 2 engine was nowhere near ready to take on such an ambitious project. We've talked about Left 4 Dead 3 on the channel many times in the past, such as when one of the environment artists working on the project had a portfolio hosting a bunch of what were assumed to be Left 4 Dead 3 screenshots. The confirmation of the game taking place in Morocco lines up with the architecture seen within these screenshots and all but confirms their legitimacy. However, the now knowledge that Left 4 Dead 3 was open world also ties it with a previous 2015 leak of lights.txt, a less popular file that leaked alongside things like RPG.txt and most famously HL3.txt through Dota 2 in October of that year. Lights.txt describes a day-night cycle within Source 2, going so far as to allow for different moon cycles to control tides within the game, and the length of day being changed by what point in time you are in a year and what hemisphere you're supposed to be playing in. The day-night cycle was far too advanced for even an open-world Left 4 Dead game, as of course it was only supposed to take place in Morocco, but it also ties into yet another leak. In February of 2016, Valve accidentally left public an archive of the Steam VR Performance Test Bench demo, a Source 2 program used to test to see if a user's computer was ready to handle the then-to-be-released HTC Vive running the Steam VR software. This test bench was supposed to run the user's PC through an abridged version of the robot repair demo, but because the archive of earlier versions was accidentally left public, a significant amount of internal VR development files leaked alongside, including VR L4D characters and VR L4D characters Scooty 2. These are in development Source 2 maps that call a significant amount of unknown and unobtainable Left 4 Dead 3 assets. Oh, and also on a completely unrelated side note, In a statement given by Doug Lombardi, VP of PR at Valve Software, to IGN in question to a recently semi-confirmed Left 4 Dead 3 by an HTC representative at an official press conference, quote, "We've seen rumors to this effect for the last couple months. We did briefly explore some Left 4 Dead next-gen opportunities a few years ago, but we are absolutely not working on anything Left 4 Dead related and haven't for years. It's clear some people are having fun creating misinformation to spin up the community and other outlets. Unfortunately, for now, a new Left 4 Dead game is not something we're working on." IGN then followed up this quote with, quote, "The statement follows an uptick in rumors regarding Left 4 Dead 3 thanks to reports from YouTube channels like Valve News Network claiming to have leaked Left 4 Dead 3 screenshots," end quote. Completely unrelated side note, and this has been a little Valve News Network departure. Adios. Of course, the final hours goes into a significant amount of other canceled Source 2 and non-Source 2 Valve projects, one being called ARTI. Quote, "In part, due to the uncertainty around Source 2, another team at Valve started work on a project with its own proprietary technology base, a voxel-based game engine, now referred to internally as ARTI. This fun, lighthearted game, in a similar vein to the Portal series, transported players to a manipulatable world with full construction and deconstruction abilities, not unlike Minecraft. An early demo featured a talking character named King Kevin, voiced in the demos by Valve writer Eric Wolpa. Players helped the king break out of prison by using their abilities such as tearing down walls, building bridges, and shrinking animals and objects to impact the world in real time. Valve was unable to get Source 2 to a point where they were happy creating games with it. In fact, most major things required for a functional game engine were just missing from Source 2, and because many people wanted to just jump ship to other engines like Unreal and Unity to finish these games off, while other camps at Valve wanted to finish Source 2, these projects could never get off the ground, so things like Left 4 Dead 3 were cancelled in the wake of this disagreement and unfinished software. In the face of this difficulty, Valve just didn't do anything with Source 2 for a while, and instead made Artifact, a Minecraft clone that was cancelled in 2017, and the name of which was then borrowed by another project going on internally since 2015 called the Dota card game, and the rest is history. We know for a fact that ARTI is actually called Artifact as the files hosted within the final hours, showing 5 pages of an introductory script written by Eric Wolpa actually being labeled as Artifact Demo. Another game discussed within the final hours that I learned a significant amount from was Half-Life 3. Quote, "While names and numbers often don't mean much at Valve in the early days of a project's generation, David Spare and a small team spent more than a year prototyping a potential next step for the Half-Life franchise using Source 2. At first, the work involved porting more than 350 entities from Half-Life 2 over to Source 2, such as characters, objects, and other files. Quote, "The game would find a building, seal up all the windows so that there was only one way in, put a citizen or prisoner somewhere in the building, and then populate the building with enemies. You, as the player, would have to find a way to get into the building and locate the prisoner. The route was naturally different every time. Conceptually, these procedurally generated skirmishes would fit between more crafted story moments that players had grown to love in traditional Half-Life games." It's interesting to state that the version of Half-Life 3 that is being mentioned here is not confirmed to be any version that we had previously known about. The final hours specifically states that there were 6 different attempts to create a follow-up to Half-Life 2 Episode 2 between 2007 and Half-Life Alyx. This roguelike Half-Life game could be the Post-Human League. It could be what we saw in HL3.txt, or it could be something entirely different. Another game that we got a little bit more information on was the RPG. Quote, "Originally conceived as a new intellectual property, Valve's role-playing game, called, yes, RPG, was inspired by titles like Monster Hunter, Dark Souls, and even the Elder Scrolls. Quote, "People wanted to make an RPG game modularly in public, like shipping smaller parts of an experience over time and adding features." RPG, however, never left the conceptual stage. At one point, the RPG team even experimented with flipping it into a single-player Dota RPG starring Axe. Former Valve artist Drew Wolf put up on his portfolio a lot of R&D concept work for a, quote, "untitled fantasy game." We now know that this internal R&D project, all of this art, was intended for what became Dota RPG that was later canceled. It's still very associated with the Dota franchise, as many of the characters and concepts that were once intended for this RPG have been recycled into Underlords, Artifact, and Dota 2 as a whole. Former Valve employee and CSGO team member Matt Wood was actually on this project's team and commented on it on Twitter. Wood states, quote, "Oh hey, look, they talk about one of my projects. projects. Wild. This would have been awesome, y'all. By the way, it was going to be co-op in the end, not single player. Honestly, I'm not sure why they're talking about these. Why talk about game projects that'll never reach the player's hands? Seems cruel. Also, it really wasn't an RPG in the traditional sense either. Wish they'd release a gameplay video. Someone start a petition. Okay, so it seems as if calling it an RPG is a bit of a misdirection. According to Drew Wolf, again, this is just an unnamed fantasy game that was just a general cooperative fantasy adventure that eventually was incorporated into the Dota 2 universe. Matt Wood is also saying it's not strictly an RPG, even though in that same day that we got HL3.txt, we also got RPG.txt, talking about just an IP-less world spawn events with quests and quest citizens and other basic RPG mechanics. If you want to see a gameplay video, let Valve know. Matt Wood thinks we should see one, and he was on that project. Also learned is that in the Valley of Gods, the Camposanto project that was brought into Valve following the Camposanto hires in 2018, we've learned that on July 1st, 2019, In the Valley of Gods development was officially put on hold. Within the final hours, there's a virtual tour of Valve's offices, and on some of the Camposanto's desks, we see an art book for In the Valley of Gods called The Concept So Far, an internal, unofficial art book for a project that was canned. What? We also got video of Project Shooter, a cut game from The Lab that we talked about last September. Quote, why did it never come out? Besides the internal trepidation around touching anything with Half-Life in its name that wasn't Half-Life 3, the decision to pull Shooter out of The Lab came down from the project's limited development time. Quote, even if we had pulled the Half-Life IP out of it, I don't think we could have shipped it on time. The video, of course, is incredible and shows just the earliest development that we ever had from Half-Life Alyx. Remember, everything you're seeing in Project Shooter actually ran in Unity. We also got confirmation on another canceled Half-Life game called Borealis VR. Quote, if nothing else, Shooter inspired Valve to think about creating something new with the Half-Life universe in the VR space. Mark Laidlaw, the writer behind the first two Half-Life games, started work with a small team for another Source 2 VR project set within the Half-Life universe. Laidlaw wanted to build a VR game codenamed Borealis set on the bridge of the Borealis, the Aperture Science research ship mentioned back in Half-Life 2. Players would explore the vessel as it ricocheted in time back and forth between the 7 Hours War and the time set shortly after the events of Episode 2. There was even talk of a fun VR minigame where players would fish off the bow of the Borealis. Ultimately, Borealis never gained much momentum internally and ended up in a pile of shutdown Valve prototypes. So it seems like some of the story elements that we saw in Laidlaw's Epistle 3 at one point were used in this Project Borealis VR game that Laidlaw was heading in 2015. Laidlaw, upon this news' release, said on Twitter, quote, now that Jeff Keighley's piece is out, everyone knows I spent my last years working on my passion project, a Left 4 Dead mod where you play as werewolf, Dracula, mummy, and Frankenstein, pursued by mobs of angry villagers. Unable to get traction, sued by Universal, I left in disgrace. Yeah, so I think Laidlaw's done with Valve. And also us. I understand. Next, Valve talked about Project Hot Dog, essentially recycling some of the cut concepts from the canceled Left 4 Dead 3 into VR. This was a single-player experience, and the Left 4 Dead VR game I spoke about on Twitter a few months back. Quote, feeling encouraged, Robin Walker, Adrian Fenal, and a few other developers spun up a mini-team for another potential new take on Left 4 Dead in late 2015. Tired of their project names always leaking on the internet and stirring up breathless fan excitement, the developers simply called the project Hot Dog. But after a few months of work, Walker realized Valve was beginning to repeat the same mistakes with multiple small game projects that might not get out in the public. Also, on a related note, Dario Casali gave an interview with Edge magazine back in March before the release of Half-Life Alyx. Quote, competitive multiplayer games were rejected because of their reliance on player numbers, something that VR wouldn't be able to provide. Casali briefly worked on a Left 4 Dead VR prototype. It was creepy as hell, he said, but was missing some essential Left 4 Deadness. Now that we know that this project was named Hot Dog, a lot of data mining work is being done on my end. However, we do know that retired engineer, one of the characters that eventually evolved into Russell, was at this point considered as a main character for Hot Dog. We also have a developer test map from Hot Dog that leaked back in early 2016, again from the Steam VR test bench demo archive. So following Hot Dog, the team actually started work on what became Half-Life Alyx with a prototype that was internally titled E1M1. We have gameplay footage of nearly that entire prototype thanks to Jeff Keighley. Quote, in February of 2016, 4 Valve employees, Robin Walker, Dario Casali, Adrian Fenal, and Michael Copeland, started an experiment to see if Half-Life in VR would indeed be a compelling proposition. The demo was a 10-minute sequence developed in 6 weeks on Source 2 with pre-existing Half-Life 2 assets. Side note, because Project Shooter existed, this isn't the first time they developed a Half-Life VR prototype. This is prototype number 2. This experiment really wasn't wasn't made to see if Half-Life in VR was a compelling proposition. They already knew that with Project Shooter. E1M1 was a rudimentary prototype. The goal was to prove if Half-Life style combat exploration and puzzle solving could translate from traditional keyboard and mouse gameplay to a 6 degrees of freedom in virtual reality. Using the gloves in Counter-Strike as VR hands, players of the prototype explored a dimly lit Half-Life sewer environment with a flashlight, battled against headcrabs, and solved puzzles using what Casali referred to as a comically large key that had to be put in a lock, and a comically large electric plug that needed to be dragged into a socket. Okay, a few notes. Number 1, the comically large key model still exists in the files of Half-Life Alyx today. Number 2, the comically large electric plug and socket are literally just ported assets from Half-Life 2. Jeff Keighley continues, quote, as the team began to scope out the Half-Life VR project, they envisioned a game with a limited scope, a 4 or 5 hour experience in Half-Life 2's world that would take about a year to develop. To further reduce the art requirements, the team planned on only using existing HL2 assets, art, and animations. It's also from this time that the leaked map Strider Canyon from the leaked 2016 Steam VR Performance Test Bench archive was being developed. We now have a completed full version of this recorded in the final hours. Tristan Reedford on the development of Strider specifically said, quote, I remember asking Ted Backman, the designer of the original creatures, are Striders just creatures that Combine jam bits of machinery into? And he said that no, the Combine actually scanned the Strider in its natural environment and then recreate it synthetically. So for HLVR, we thought we'd make a Strider where the recreation wasn't quite perfected yet. That's where you get the construction Strider that the Combine workers from Half-Life Alyx are riding in the beginning of Half-Life Alyx. Amazing stuff. Next, and this is a small detail, Jeff Keighley shows off some concepts for early iterations of Combine workers. He included concept art for Half-Life Alyx's cut version of the Cremator. In case you don't know, the Cremator is a cut enemy from Half-Life 2, dating back to around 2001 or 2002. He would patrol the streets of the industrial-style City 17 to make sure that any Zen floral and fauna that may have made it through the city walls would be immediately killed by the flamethrower that it carried. However, if a citizen of City 17 was caught outside after curfew, well, the Cremator just considers you collateral damage. The Cremator is the coolest enemy concept that Valve created for Half-Life 2 that they cut. I had reported multiple times back in 2017 and 2018 that Valve was bringing him back for Half-Life Alyx, and when HLA released, he was nowhere to be found. Thank God we have proof that that's actually the case. Jeff then went into the design of Russell and his original iteration, Laszlo, who was an entirely different character. Quote, initially, the character that would send Alyx on a test was a man named Laszlo. Die-hard fans of Half-Life 2 may remember him as the character briefly featured in Episode 2. Side note, no, Laszlo was in Sand Traps, Keep Off the Sand from Half-Life 2, not Episode 2. He was, quote, the finest mind of his generation who gets killed by antlions in the Sand Traps level. Quote, he was a friend of the family uncle guy who was a little kooky. Gives her a gun and permission to go into City 17's quarantine zone because there's a message directed at her from the Vortigaunt cutoff from the Vortessence. That was explained by David Speyer. This is Laszlo. I have so much to say about Laszlo, Yosef, and Russell. Bear with me. The evolution of Russell as a character is super interesting and is another story for another day. Quote, while Alyx was growing quickly into Valve's largest team, other projects, and VR projects no less, were simmering in other parts of the building. As Gabe Newell told the media in early 2017, Valve had 3 different full-scale VR games in development. Jeff answers the question, what were the 3 VR games? They were Half-Life Alyx, the original Artifact project, which was resurrected as a VR experience, and a third project, codenamed SimTrek, prototyped by some of the members of the team behind the Kerbal Space program. Development on both of those projects stopped, however, as Alyx's team size continued to grow. Before Eric Wolpa and Jay Pinkerton, along with a few other Valve writers, took the reins of the Half-Life Alyx story in early 2019, the story was helmed by the Invisible Hours writer Rob Yescom. This story is completely different, but interestingly, the level design, chapter progression, and mechanics were almost identical. So it was up to Eric Wolpa, Jay Pinkerton, and the other Valve writers to essentially change nothing in the mechanics and level design in early 2019, yet change the entire story. We did get some information on the original story, however. Quote, the Combine used a familiar figure as the face of the human acquiesce, Eli Vance, Alyx's father. In early passes of the script, Eli, captured by the Combine, was forced to read propaganda videos to protect his daughter. His captor was Han, a mysterious female agitator whose brain had been sucked out and replaced by the Combine. In one proposed sequence, Han even tortured Eli after he pushed back against recording yet another propaganda video. There is so much to talk about on this original story in terms of both the introduction and the outro. This is my favorite thing that I have learned about, and I am so grateful that Jeff didn't ruin the whole thing, because I have been studying this for months. The woman who's talking to the Combine advisor near the end of Half-Life Alyx, or as we call her on this channel, the Shadow Scientist lady, is just Han's model. The Final Hours says that Han's model was reused as Olga. That's not entirely true, because Han's model is still in the game, and it's the Shadow Scientist lady. She just doesn't have her texture. However, we have concept art that fits that texture perfectly within the Final Hours, and the only thing that would point towards Olga, the character you see in the laundromat at the very beginning of Half-Life Alyx, would at all be related to Han, is a pin on her chest that does read Han. This is so complicated, and we learned just a significant amount of both the intro and outro. For example, one of the original pitched outros of the game was finding the G-Man and he walking you through a bunch of red doors. Think of BioShock Infinite's ending, but instead of seeing lighthouses in BioShock 1, you see a bunch of areas from Half-Life 1, 2, and the episodes. In another pitched version of the ending, you were to stop Gordon from pushing in the crystal at the beginning of Half-Life 1. However, both of those were never even prototyped in engine and were only concepts. What was prototyped was, quote, was a Groundhog's Day situation where Alyx would just wake up at the beginning of the game again and stop Eli from doing any of these propaganda videos by handing him a business card from the G-Man. Another fun tidbit, quote, in VR, players would physically pull out shells or clips from their backpack and insert them into a gun like Alyx's pistol, which was one of the few art assets from the unreleased Half-Life 2 Episode 3 that the team repurposed for the VR game. I have so many questions to ask. Half-Life 2 Episode 3 still starred Gordon Freeman. Why was Gordon using Alyx's pistol? Did Alyx die in Episode 3 at any point? Also, it goes on to describe a few other cut weapons. Quote, other weapons were prototyped, including a slingshot, a shield, a rocket launcher, a deployable trip mine, and a grenade with a pin. An entire video on all the canceled weapons and weapon upgrades is being planned and is actually very far along. Quote, back in 2007, in the final months of production on Half-Life 2, Episode 2, the team planned to end that game with a fun sequence featuring Lamar, Kleiner's pet headcrab, floating in orbit outside the rocket that launched from White Moon Base. White Moon Base? You mean White Forest? Newell, however, wanted something bigger and more shocking. He suggested a considerably large nudge, as the G-Man would put it. The team would kill off a major character for a cliffhanger that pays off in Episode 3. Jeff then goes into how the original proposed person to be killed was Kleiner, and that's interesting because in an early iteration of Half-Life 2 script, Kleiner actually died in the failed teleportation sequence at the beginning of Half-Life 2. And lastly, quote, privately, most of the team hopes that the next big thing will indeed be a full-scale Half-Life game built not for VR, but as a game accessible across all traditional gaming platforms. Some at Valve wonder if the company wants to take on such a large project. Others wonder if more VR games might be in the future, as Valve continues to push further into the VR hardware space. Maybe there will be surprises as well, including a top-secret new project that another small team at Valve has been working on since the first part of 2018. VNN viewers of at least over a year likely remember a report I published on July 17, 2019, called 2 Half-Life games are in development, HLVR and Citadel. Through a few leaks in a Dota 2 update on that same day, we found soundscapes and bot nav mesh markups for a project internally titled Citadel. Citadel having something to do with a top-down camera, bots, a minimap, and some kind of asymmetric multiplayer system, and we now have confirmation that yes, it's in VR, and yes, it's still alive and kicking, because the timeline for Citadel puts it at starting production around late 2017 or early 2018. I was under the impression that Citadel actually ceased development when HLA started up developing again. That doesn't seem to be the case. So everybody get ready. Citadel's the new HLVR, even if that game is significantly smaller in scope than Half-Life Alyx. Finally, I have something to speculate on again. Thank you very much for watching. If you want to support videos like these, I have a Patreon page. It would super help me out if you could support it. Link down in the description below. I'm Tyler McVicker. This is Valve News Network. Have a good day. Adios.